Hi guys, Olive here today to bring you the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. If you've never seen Wishbone before, it was a television program directed at kids, and each half-hour episode was broken down into two parallel storylines. The first storyline was always an adaptation of a work of literature. Now, that most frequently was a book, but it could also be a narrative poem, a short story, a play, a myth, a legend, a folktale, anything like that. And then in the second storyline, we followed a 1990s family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone. And whatever was going on with them in their storyline always related back to the themes found within the literary adaptation. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video, and I compare that episode to the literary work that they took on within it. Did they keep everything the same from it, or did they change things? Were they faithful enough to give the viewer a good sense of what that literary work is all about? Did they pull any kind of moral message out of that work to communicate to the young audience of the show? And most critically, was it fun to watch? In today's video, we will be looking at a late season 1 episode of Wishbone titled Dances with Dogs that was inspired by the Native American tale, The Story of the Deathless Voice. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the start of this episode, a Navajo friend of the Talbot family named Lee is over at the house, contemplating what Native American story he should tell at the 5th annual storytelling series at the library. Joe starts asking Lee about where his stories come from, and Lee explains that many of them were passed down the generations, and he learned them too so he could pass them down someday. He values them because they're fun to learn, and because each story is a path to follow. He starts telling a story from the Dakota tribe, who hailed from an area that we now know as Minnesota. The story of the Deathless Voice, as it's called, is about a group of warriors following a trail on the lookout for an enemy that was attempting to take over their hunting grounds. They had long been searching, and were listening out for any movement since the smallest sound could foretell an ambush. They stop to make camp and assign a young warrior played by Wishbone to the first watch. It's here that Lee leaves everyone in the Talbot household on a cliffhanger, but he promises to finish the story soon. And he gets the idea that for the event, he'd like to tell one of his grandmother's stories, but he'd also like if some volunteers would tell their own family stories. And Joe suggests that he tell a story about his dad, who was actually good friends with Lee while he was alive. Joe and Ellen start going through old scrapbooks looking for memories of Joe's dad. Joe admits that it's a good way for him to learn more about his dad, since he doesn't remember him all that well. Joe had just turned 6 years old when they lost him. The next day, Joe and crew are going through boxes of memories of Joe's dad, when Joe starts feeling a little discouraged about just how accomplished his father was. He doesn't feel anything like him. He doesn't feel connected to him through doing this. Lee and Wanda show up, and to take his mind off of things, Joe requests that Lee finish the story he started telling the day before. Lee continues at the warriors' camp, where Wishbone, as the young warrior, stands watch, when suddenly the whole camp starts hearing a song, which they perceive as the enemy. The group quickly follows the song until it leads them to a tree, where the noise seems to be coming from. In the middle of the story, Joe gets upset, saying he doesn't want to listen anymore, nor does he want to tell his own story that night. He storms out and goes to a special place for him, the tree with the old tire swing where he remembers spending time with his dad. His mom and Lee find him there, and he admits that he worries he's never going to be as great as his dad was. Ellen observes that a list of accomplishments isn't going to make Joe feel like his dad was a real person, and certainly not someone he'll ever be able to know. Ellen counters that Joe's dad is a part of him, and that Joe was a part of his father's story. Lee offers to keep telling his story, explaining that the warriors don't know what to do about the voice they were hearing coming from the tree until the song abruptly stops. The young warrior approaches the tree and sees a pile of bones at its base. The vision of a warrior appears to all of them, and the leader of their group says the bones must have belonged to a great warrior whose voice could not be silenced by death. He says that they will honor this warrior by learning his song, which they then take back to their village to share with everyone. Underneath a different tree, Lee and Ellen urge Joe to take courage in his father's story and remind Joe that his story is still in the making, so he shouldn't look down on himself for not being as accomplished as his father yet. And Joe's mom adds that even though he was an impressive guy, Joe's dad was far from perfect. For example, he was 45 minutes late for their first date because he left the keys in his car while it was running, and then he did that exact same thing when Ellen went into labor with Joe. She had to take a taxi cab to the hospital. Finding out his dad wasn't a flawless human being, but instead someone much more relatable, makes Joe feel better. And later that night, back at the house, Joe changes his tune and agrees to still speak at the storytelling event. He starts telling his story to his mom, talking about what he does remember of his dad and how his mom's stories of his dad keep him alive for Joe. That's what Lee communicates at the event, too. That people's spirits, that their memories are kept alive through storytelling. He invites everyone in the room to imagine that they are all seated around a kitchen table, sharing stories. Everyone is welcome there. Everyone's story has a place there. And then a performer dances to the song of the Deathless Voice. So let's talk about this episode, which I think has to be one of the most, if not the single most profound episode in this entire series. I have covered most of the series thus far, so I feel pretty confident in saying that. I cannot imagine that any of the episodes I have left to cover could even come close to how moving and heartfelt this episode was. Not unlike the warriors in the story, I guess, I had to search high and low for the source material for this one. I don't know what that says, but I did finally find a PDF online that contained the story of the Deathless Voice. I'll link that for you below so you don't have to search for it. You can just read it if you'd like. It is a very short story, and the writers of this episode recounted it pretty much perfectly. That tends to happen with short source material within Wishbone. They have time to cover everything, so it tends to be a lot more of a faithful adaptation. But I have to say, this adaptation was essentially flawless. I don't know if I've ever said that a Wishbone adaptation was flawless before. I mean, I would say on average, the Wishbone adaptations tend to be pretty solid, like pretty decent, but I don't think any of them have been as perfect as this one was, at least to me. And something else that makes this episode pretty unique is the fact that it's one of the very few in which Wishbone isn't telling the story. We're hearing the story from Lee. And it's the only one I can think of where the kids in the story are learning the source material along with us. So we're not just bouncing back and forth between a story adaptation and the real life storyline. They're actually flowing in and out of each other. And it made me wonder how this show would have worked if that was the structure of every episode. Like the kids within the episode are learning about the source material along with us, and then it just so happens to have something to do with what they're going through at the time. I think they probably could have had some success in doing that, although I think writing those episodes would have been a lot harder. Even though that adaptation was so tremendous, it's actually the moral message of this episode that I think made it so profound. I likely don't need to tell you what that is. It was probably clear as I did my recap of the episode. But this episode is all about the power that stories have to keep people, to keep their spirits alive in our memories. So that warrior under the tree may have died, but his song will live on because people learned it and will pass it down. And Joe's dad, he may be gone, but he will live on because of the stories that Ellen tells Joe about him. It's a testament to the power of stories, but it's also meant to highlight the importance of the oral tradition and how critical it is to honor the memories of those we've lost. Think about what big concepts those are for young people, and yet I am so glad the writers of this show trusted their audience with it. Not for a moment did I feel like they were talking down to them. And I think showing kids this, even if they've never lost someone, even if they're completely unfamiliar with grief, getting to see what it looks like being confronted with a harder topic like this, I think will give them good practice in dealing with those things. It'll give them practice in feeling empathy for these characters they've come to know and love. And then imagine if a kid who had lost a loved one watched this. Imagine how comforting that would have been to be able to relate to Joe and to also start thinking about their own memories of the person they've lost. I'm not going to lie, I teared up a little bit when Joe was telling his mom that her stories keep his dad alive for him. I mean, I have come to care for these characters so much, not just because I watched this show as a kid, but through this series. Like, I know these characters, I love them. And to see them take on these really hard topics, these really gut-wrenching topics with such humanity and grace, it was touching. And then there's the element of this episode that is celebrating Native American culture and storytelling without patting themselves on the back for having done so. Like, they're not doing it because they feel obligated to do it. They're doing it because they value Lee and his stories and everything they represent. And I also loved right at the end of this episode that they highlighted that stories are something that we all have in common. It is something shared across our human family. There's really only one negative that I saw about this episode, and maybe it sounds nitpicky, but it is something that I noticed. I noticed that they were padding a lot of scenes, like making them longer than they needed to be. They were lingering on certain scenes a little bit too long. And then right at the end of the episode, they had like this montage of clips that we had just seen from within the episode, almost like a recap that we really didn't need. Like, I just saw the episode, I don't need that. And I think they did all of that for length, like they were trying to reach the length of episode they needed. And I think they could have done more within the episode, like add more to it as opposed to extending certain scenes. Like, why didn't we see the people at the storytelling event telling some of their stories? Why didn't we hear Joe telling his story at the event versus hearing it the night before? I think if they had made some of those choices, this would have been a perfect episode for me. But even as it is, it comes very close. This is definitely now one of my all-time favorite episodes of Wishbone. But those were my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone. I would love to hear yours down in the comment section below. And if you want to see more of these What's the Story Wishbone videos that I do, I have created a playlist that contains all the ones I've done up to this point, which is now most of them. I am nearly done with this series, and it will contain all the ones I have left to do, which again isn't very many. So if you have a specific episode in mind that you'd like to see, there's a very high likelihood that I've covered it already. So please do check out that playlist. You can also check out the playlist if you just want to start from the very beginning and watch them all. It'll be linked for you in the description box below and up in the cards. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.